Larson Halleck here, and welcome back to Manthropology. And it's time, once again, for my greatest duty as a manthropologist, debunking the leftist nonsense that is used as a cudgel against man, tribe, and nation. We have already discussed conquest and imperialism. Now we can discuss slavery. Now, just to clarify, of course America had slavery. European countries had slavery. I'm not denying any of that. But the things we're going to be debunking are twofold. One is that America and/or European slavery were the most widespread and numerous of all slaveries, and the other is that these forms of slavery were more cruel than any others. And while we're at it, let's tackle the allegations that America's wealth is built on slaves. The first of these, being an objective and quantifiable concept, can be debunked very quickly and easily. Blam! This is a map of the transatlantic slave trade. We can point out the big colonial powers, the British colonies, America and various Caribbean sundries, the French colonies, Haiti and various other sundries, the Portuguese in Brazil, and of course the Spanish, which can be quantified as all that shit. As you can see, the USA, while enjoying its share of the blackbird trade, took the least amount of slaves, about 500,000 or so, and the overwhelming amount of slaves went to Latin America, not Anglo or French America. The U.S. banned the importation of slaves in the early 1800s, which meant that any growth of slavery from then until 1865 was strictly from natural population growth. And yes, by that, I mean slave owners would encourage their female slaves to have as many kids as possible to create more workers. As a side note, I would highly recommend that you read the slave narratives recorded by the WPA. Fascinating stuff. But that's just the Western Hemisphere. What of slavery in the Old World? Where should we start discussing this? Oh, I don't know. Maybe, the origin of the word slave? The word slave is derived from the word Slav, the Eastern European ethnic and linguistic group that was overwhelmingly used as a source of chattel in the Mediterranean world by both Arabs and Byzantines. Seems to me that if a tribe's name is being turned into a synonym for unpaid chattel laborer, there were probably a lot of them being shanghaied. How many white slaves were taken, might I ask? Well, in the 19th century alone, there were about 1 million throughout the Muslim world. The Arab slave trade goes back further in time than the Muslim religion itself, so it's probably an equivalent amount to the 10 million sent to the Western Hemisphere. That's me being as gentle as possible. And that's not even counting the black slave trade, which also went on in the Arab world, and still goes on right now as we speak. How many blacks were taken as slaves? Well, it is estimated that between 1500 and 1900, yes, 1900, there were 5 million black slaves bought and sold throughout the Arab world. And then imagine that happening for another 900 years previously. So we can see that at least one direction of slave trading was at minimum as extensive and likely far more extensive than the transatlantic. Slavery also existed in Africa and amongst Mesoamericans and amongst Northern European countries called thraldom. Debt peonage existed in India and China, so yeah, it's hard to find a country that didn't have slavery at some point. Having taken in all this information, some of you are probably asking, why were there relatively few slaves imported to the US and so many to a place like Brazil? Well, that segues directly into the second point. Was American or Western slavery more brutal than other forms? Make no mistake about it, American slavery was certainly brutal, and it's nothing I would wish upon anybody. The physical, emotional, and sexual abuses that we are constantly lectured about did happen, and there is no denying that. But of course, how does it compare to the other forms of slavery? While sexual abuse undoubtedly occurs wherever slavery occurs, the Arab slave trade can be said to be worse in this respect. How am I quantifying this, you might ask? In the transatlantic slave trade, 2/3 of the slaves imported were men, whereas in the Arab slave trade, 2/3 of the slaves were women. That would seem to suggest that the primary goal in, say, the antebellum South was in fact agricultural labor, with sex being a secondary fringe benefit, whereas in the Arab world, sex was the primary goal. If you want to talk about hypocrisy, I would like to remind you of how the British Empire, the originators of the phrase life, liberty, and property, took twice the amount of slaves that the USA did. Similarly, the Empire of France took 4 times the amount of slaves of the United States. And the famous Haitian Rebellion took place during Napoleon's reign. In other words, 20 years after all the talk of liberty, equality, and fraternity. Of course, the Europeans were smart enough to have their plantations in overseas colonies, which conveniently allows them to wash their hands of the matter. If you want to talk about death rates, the Middle Passage across the Atlantic was indeed horrific, estimated to have killed between 10 and 30% of those on it. Trans-Saharan land transport, in contrast, killed at least half, and by some estimates up to 75%. And once you got there, how were the casualty rates? Well, in the U.S., 500,000 imported slaves have become 40 million free blacks over the last 400 years or so. While they were certainly abused and downtrodden, as bad as it was, it could have been worse, like, I don't know, Brazil and the Caribbean, where the common practice was to work slaves to death and then just bring in some more. Perhaps that might be why there were far greater numbers of slave revolts in Latin America than Anglo-America. And that's why so many slaves went to Latin America in the first place. As a side note, Anglo-America actually developed some pretty clever psychological means of control to keep their slaves docile, rather than just using the whip hand. Those means of control were actually pretty similar to what modern corporations do to their employees. Time on the Cross, the best book ever written on American slavery in my opinion, also points out on average, slaves worked about 50 to 60 hour weeks. Some of you are probably looking at your pay stubs right about now. Not to be outdone, the Arab slave trade was also quite brutal. Female and male genital mutilation, hobbling, shoving live insects into people's orifices, and the like. Children born of female slaves and Arab masters would almost always be killed, which might be why you see a lot less light-skinned black people in the Arab world than you would in, say, Virginia. Maybe it's just a coincidence, I don't know. Of the Saharan salt mines, it is said that no slave lived for more than 5 years. Bernard Lewis, Race and Slavery in the Middle East. Even within Africa itself, slavery was every bit as cruel as it was in the Western world, if not more so. But the principal sacrifice is that of one slave from each of the nations under the dominion of the paramount chief, the heads of whom are carried in triumph and exhibited to the populace, accompanied by drums and other instruments. The bodies are added to those of the other animals, and all cooked together, and distributed as a savory dish to the chief and the other nobles. Francisco Valdez, 6 years of travel in Western Africa. Similar tales are confirmed by other travelers. But what of the last charge, that America's wealth is built on slavery? Well, if slavery is the most surefire way to generate wealth, then why did the South lose the American Civil War? Largely due to its outstanding disadvantages in manpower and materiel. If slavery is such a surefire way to make money, then why weren't they outgunning and outproducing the Yankees? Why has the American South, the part of the country that historically had the most slaves, been the poorest part of the country? And why is it still the poorest part of the country? Why did America only become a great power after the abolition of slavery? And, hypothetically speaking, even if the South was the wealthiest region of the United States, the fact that the deadliest war fought in the Western Hemisphere was fought entirely in the South, you'd think that would have destroyed any wealth that was saved. For that matter, considering that some parts of the Arab world had legal slavery up until the 1960s, why are they not the wealthiest people in the world? Why is Mauritania, a country with legal slavery, still a third world basket case? In fact, somebody has calculated the money made from American slavery. It's between $1 to $10 trillion, which is to say about 1 year's gross domestic product. Wow, it's almost as if slavery isn't a guarantee to make money. In fact, it's actually wildly inefficient and costly for any remotely industrialized society. So that's a very brief summary of slavery as practiced worldwide. It happened throughout the world to all colors and creeds, and it should rightfully be abolished wherever it is found. But to cast it as a uniquely American or even uniquely white evil is a gross distortion of historical fact that is inevitably used to push an agenda. There are, in fact, more slaves in the world right now, as we speak, than there have ever been in history, but they're all in non-white countries, so who gives a shit about them? I'm Larson Halleck, and I realize there were really no laughs in this episode. This is not exactly the most pleasant subject matter, but there was a point that had to be made, and I've made it. And now, a word from our sponsors. Hello, are you a fan of Larson Halleck and the Barbaric Gentleman? Of course you are, otherwise you wouldn't be watching. Would you like to help the channel grow? Would you like to help me out? If so, here's how you can. You can go to patreon.com/LarsonHalleck and join the ranks of these illustrious heroes. You can also go to www.paypal.me/LarsonHalleck to also donate some money. You can also buy my book. The Patreon, the PayPal, and the link to my book are all found in the video description. You can also follow me on Twitter or on Instagram. I no longer advertise my Gab because Gab sucks. Otherwise, enjoy, keep watching the videos, and spread the word.